Hi, this is Richard Edelman, and you're listening to The Trust Makers.
Hi, I'm Sat Dayal, Managing Director of Technology at Edelman. Climate change, geopolitical volatility, and accelerating technological disruption are some of the forces redrawing the global map. Amid this turbulence, trust is becoming harder to sustain. This year's Edelman Trust Barometer shows that public confidence in institutions is wavering, especially when it comes to emerging technologies like AI. Our guest today is someone who has spent his career seeking to design a world that's not just more resilient, but more trustworthy. Dr. Parag Khanna. Parag is a leading global strategy advisor, founder and CEO of AlphaGeo, and the best-selling author of influential books like Move, Connectography, and The Future is Asian. Over the last 2 decades, he's helped shape how policymakers and executives understand everything from infrastructure corridors to climate mobility, from smart governance to global connectivity. Through AlphaGeo, he is now using AI and geospatial intelligence to model climate resilience and investment risk, offering a new blueprint for how systems can stay adaptive and trusted in the era of constant change. Parag, welcome to the Trust Makers.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Well, let's kick off with a question about yourself, actually. You spent years mapping the world, not just geopolitics, but supply chains, climate corridors, and population flows. What first pulled you into this way of seeing things?
Well, first of all, thank you again, Seth. Great to be with you and really looking forward to this conversation. So for me, this is the easiest question to answer. Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. My Cartesianism is I travel, therefore I am. So with me, it all just comes back to having been raised the way I fortunately was, which is just traveling a lot. So appreciating geography, that became something very formal for me. And now I write about, think about, and physically, cartographically map out these layers of geography that are physical and natural geography, political geography like borders and states, functional geography like supply chains and urbanization and infrastructure, and then human geography, of course, which is demographics and migration and so forth. So for me, the world can be understood best through this complex interplay of these geographical layers, which we should endeavor to physically, visually, in a multidimensional and even an animated way visualize. So that those are the themes and threads that really drive through my work.
Can I push that a little bit more just to understand? Because it's the work that I've seen of yours, and I was drawn in through, I think the first time I saw you on a TED Talk, talking about connectivity there, and I started to see the world completely differently. I mean, was there something around the aesthetic that comes into your play that really drove you? I'm just curious on that side, really, personally.
So there is that love of maps and cartographical artifacts, globes and other kinds of things. Every year, one or more of my children will give me a gift for my birthday that involves a globe or a map. It's inevitable, and it's always very welcome. So that you can see them around my study as well. So there is that, but it did become, you might say, an amateur / professional aesthetic, obsession or vocation, because with that book, Connectography, some of those maps did wind up in galleries and exhibits, but most importantly, they were made by truly professional cartographic teams that I worked with very intimately, and quite frankly, almost as much time went into working with those teams on every one of the 3 or 4 dozen maps that made it into the book out of a wider array that we had designed, each one requiring, dozens of drafts. As much time went into that as the writing of the book in the end, and it proved to be equally rewarding. So that was the point, that's, over a decade ago, where I said, the visualization element, seeing is believing, does matter as much as the written word, especially when you're trying to explain complex phenomena and processes where words alone can convey a certain imagery, but why not just create that imagery?
No, thank you. That makes sense. That helps me out there. So I was just, as I say, it goes back to that time when I was like, that's incredibly powerful way of telling a story, I think, anyway, for people I first engage in your work. Then I move on to next question. Climate change remains one of the more divisive trust issues globally. Tell us about your concept of programmable geography and how you think geospatial analytics could help rebuild public trust in climate action.
This is clearly such a pressing, existential issue. So I'm really glad that you've raised this. So programmable geography, first and foremost, is meant to be the agency that we develop and embrace and utilize to modify the map, to redraw the lines on the map in ways that are more optimal for humanity. The geography of where people are and where resources are and where borders are and where economic activity is literally misaligned, right? There's a lot of inefficiency, to say nothing of tragedy, embedded in this misalignment and caused by this misalignment. And yet we have the capacity to change it. We can change where borders are. We can change where we build things. We can move resources. We can move people. And we're not doing that in a dynamic, evolving, unfolding way that eventually results in a more optimal and fluid paradigm that I'm calling programmable geography. And it is climate change that makes this misalignment the most acute. Because as I've shown with some of these animations, if you look at the impact of rising temperatures above the pre-industrial baseline as we've crossed 1.5 degrees average to 2 degrees and eventually 2.5 degrees, this is having a nonlinear and accelerating impact on many parts of the world. And the world is in effect being divided into red zones and green zones. In a way. Now, even green zones, to be clear, aren't perfect. On some of these maps, you see that Canada and Russia appear more green, more livable, more habitable relative to where they were before. But did you know that the forest fires that are breaking out and flaring and raging year-round at this point in Canada and Russia are as bad or worse than anything that's happening in the Amazon rainforest? So no place is immune. And so we have to think about, first of all, how do we engage in adaptation and in the management of this climate stress and dislocation of people, of course. And then we have to think about where is humanity going to most likely need to resettle. And one of the things I say to try and simplify all of this complexity is either we can move technologies to people in the places where they are. That can be water desalination. It can be genetically modified seeds. It can be shelter. Or you can move people to the geography of resources, to stable geographies. Are you moving resources to people or people to resources? And that those are the most noble humanitarian ends that we can pursue right now. And both of those would contribute, of course, to reprogramming geography. But yes, it is the climate crisis that makes this geographical misalignment as acute and existentially urgent to address as anything else that's happening right now.
What kind of technologies are you seeing right now that give you that sense that actually it's within the grasp to start even thinking about programming geospatial spaces?
I think the answer to this question is unfortunately something that isn't really a all-in-one planetary scale solution. And the reason is twofold. Reason number one is that climate adaptation, adapting physical locations, our societies, our communities, our nations, our cities to climate change is a local private good, is what you would call it in economic terms. The investments that you make in a seawall on the coast of your city benefit your city and you. They don't benefit anyone on the other side of the world. Whereas with decarbonization initiatives, right, mitigating climate change, reducing emissions, that's considered a global public good, right? So we're dealing with opposite, not literally opposite, but different kinds of investments. So adaptation is a local private good. And therefore, it's not necessarily a wave the wand and get all the governments together and pass a treaty like the Paris Agreement, which in any case hasn't been implemented. And the second reason is that migration is quite literally never going to be a centrally regulated phenomenon, right? We will never have a powerful enough central sovereign or supranational multilateral body that regulates global migration because it butts up against sovereignty. And when all trappings of sovereignty have been superseded and transcended by globalization, you still have that one thing left for governments, which is I control who comes across my border, right? Controlling the movement of human beings across your border is that final vestige of sovereignty that no government is ever going to give up the right to control. So these two deep philosophical, legal, conceptual truths make it very difficult for us to simply say, yes, programmable geography is going to happen. It's literally not. It's going to be something that is truly local and bilateral and regional. It'll be what African countries do with each other, what European countries do with each other, what some European countries do with some African countries, what Japan does with some countries, and so on and so forth. It will be emergent, in some places more, in some places less. And it's most definitely, when it comes to migration, a matter of trust. Do you trust who's coming in? Do you trust the origin country? Do you trust the visa processing? And all of these kinds of things come into play very, very urgently. And so I would focus the politics less on what happens up here at that global multilateral level and much more down here in terms of the local systems and interventions and policies and exchanges that we can promote.
Bridges nicely to the next question, actually. Your work shows that power flows through networks, cities, and systems, not just nations. And with a tool you recently developed, the periodic table of states, you're giving us a way to assess countries not just by borders, but by capability and coherence. Yet we're seeing stable countries like Germany or the US increasingly lose public trust, while mid-tier countries gain it. So when you think about trust today, especially as communications leaders or the likes, should we be looking beyond the national identity to platforms, diasporas, or shared values as the true drivers of influence?
All of the above, I would say, first of all, but specifically on the periodic table of states, there was a need to create an index that balances the historical focus on power in terms of material capabilities as measured by GDP and military and natural resources and population with what we're calling stateness, which is fundamentally about state capacity, social cohesion, equality of infrastructure, all of these sorts of measurements. And when you balance these notions of kind of strength and stateness, and your net result is what we're calling stability, you do have a different pecking order or a modified pecking order than what we're used to. And within that, you see that countries that have that sense of that, irrespective of their physical size. So Switzerland ranks number one, for example. It's a small country, but is a strong country and is a cohesive society, despite, by the way, its rich internal diversity, linguistically and so forth. And so there was scope to actually generate some novel results where bigger isn't always better, and where democracies, especially as you pointed out, those places where right now you have waning public trust in institutions, aren't the automatic winners. Rather, you're measuring outcomes, not just inputs. And so therefore, countries like Singapore and China climb up the rankings versus where they would be in traditional indices. So in that sense, yes, we have genuinely elevated the role of trust, with this index, because as we do know, even from trust-specific surveys and research such as your own, which is excellent, you do have this phenomenon where Asian societies that are not fully democratic, do feature much higher degrees of trust in public institutions, also in private institutions, by the way, than Western societies. So trust is a very important factor that we should measure. And I'll just add one of the key metrics in there, because it does tie everything we've talked about together, which is resilience. In a world of black swans, of disruptions, of perpetual shocks, of uncertainties, resilience is something that nations and societies need to strive towards, right? Which is not only, it's a combination of how can we bounce back from stress, and how can we build systems that maintain that social cohesion and strength over time, irrespective of what disruptions we face. And we're out to measure resilience. And that's where actually geospatial data also comes in. That's where AlphaGeo comes in. We set out to answer this question: what is the mathematics of societal resilience and geographical resilience? How do you measure the resilience of a place? And it's the combination of many things, of course, which haven't been adequately fused together. And a fair bit of that is geospatially derived data sets, actually, like your infrastructure that helps you respond to climate shock, right? If there is a flood, or if there is a geological event like an earthquake, if there is an epidemic or a pandemic, right? What are your health systems? What are the quality of your drainage systems, your typhoon resistance, the strength of your buildings, right? Your social safety nets. Bring all of the food security, right? Energy security things that traditionally are just measured in silos, we've brought together and scored. Say, in fact, you can give a number, indexable number and score to the resilience of a place at a community level, at a city level, at a provincial level, at a country level. And now we have a standard and we have a roadmap.
I'm going to change gears again slightly, but quite relevant actually as it relates to our conversation around where a lot of the trust towards technology sits. We're seeing a growing divide in public trust toward emerging technologies like AI and blockchain, especially among people who already feel excluded or disempowered by institutions. And then mentioned earlier on, that's certainly where we see in some of the Western democracies. In your view, how can leaders identify which of the technologies become trusted public infrastructure versus tools that drive further polarization and that word control?
Right. Well, let's be clear. Part of the trust gap, obviously, is the underperformance of government because it hasn't embraced the kinds of technological tools and efficiencies that would bring both transparency and efficacy to government services, right? So again, to put it in more layman's terms and in a policy context, simply having the input legitimacy of democratic elections is insufficient to build trust if you're not delivering. So the fact is we have the technological tools to give everyone, a blockchain-based financial accounts, right, to be able to, in a fee-less way, do cash transfers and other kinds of benefits, not just cash benefits, but even just data related, healthcare related, all data. So digital public infrastructure, DPI, as it's known, that is built on public blockchains and on these very low cost, very trustworthy, very opt-in and inclusive toolkits that we have today are not being used nearly enough by governments. And if they were, this would be a significant step towards enhancing trust. And again, lo and behold, it's some of the countries where the people do trust the government more right now, irrespective of the type of regime, where you're seeing these technologies being deployed, where you're seeing public benefit be deployed or be achieved very quickly. That's actually reinforcing the trustworthiness of those countries. So if we want to regain trust in Western societies, as Western governments, it's not going to come merely by talking about it. It's not going to come through ephemeral and episodic dialogues. It's going to actually come from using the technologies of consultation with the public on a regular basis, not just elections. So we have survey tools. Again, we can use social media in ways that are sufficiently anonymized with metadata to get people's views and to geolocate those views, to target how services are delivered, to be culturally sensitive and so on. And we have tools, obviously, to lower the frictions, lower the transaction costs of all public services, and of course, peer-to-peer citizen engagement. So, at the end of the day, there are going to be those societies, again, irrespective of what type of regime they are, democratic or not, that embrace those tools in ways that actually have measurable public benefit and those that don't. And the former are going to gain in trust, and they're going to be more successful, more innovative, more productive, more equal societies versus the rest.
Just to kind of follow up on that, in terms of a leader in a particular company or a particular country, just a leader in themselves trying to wrestle with this challenge, how should they start to even think about evaluating these technologies? You mentioned, blockchain. You mentioned some of those infrastructure technologies, as you say. We've seen, again, through our trust data, the likes of blockchain in very Western democracies being very low and much higher in some of, let's say, the emerging economies. How can leaders start to wrap their heads around the things that are going to ensure that people, when they do arrive, don't feel like, again, they're command and control technologies, but actually they're real infrastructure that can deliver real public good?
Mm-hmm. I mean, part of the reason why there's a view that these technologies may be misused is, again, simply because we're starting from a low base of trust, unfortunately. The other is a perfectly valid assessment of the lack of competence of leaders because, we're dealing with again, this is a global phenomenon, but it's particularly pronounced in some of the low trust Western societies. You're dealing with a pretty geriatric, generation of leaders, not to be ageist, but who don't necessarily understand the technologies and therefore have not harnessed, through the kind of proper diligence and investigation and considered research, how these can be deployed. Then you have in those same countries the incumbent players, whether it's financial institutions and corporates, who resist from a competitive standpoint, democratizing access to these kinds of services. And therefore, you haven't allowed those innovations to scale across society. So a bit of all of that is at play right now. So I would say, liberating in some ways these, again, peer-to-peer ecosystems and allowing those to flourish is going to be a critical first step.
Yeah, we look at it through the lens of two, I think. The acceptance question, is it socially acceptable, these technologies? And then there's the very individual perception around the technologies. Is it going to make a difference in my life and a difference in my work? And then we ask two supporting questions. Is it the technology you trust or distrust? Or is it the humans are delivering the technology that you trust and distrust? And I think somewhere between that is an understanding of where you can start to move things forward.
Exactly.
Penultimate question, and actually this bridges on what we just talked about. You spoke recently about China's digital transformation, and according to some sources, China is edging up America's lead in AI innovation. How smart do you find China's focus on widespread adoption versus chasing AGI breakthroughs?
Right. So, with China, it is a very strong focus on practical applications, right, of AI. And of course, they do have very substantial data sets known as the Chinese population and all of its transactions and activities at their disposal, both physical and digital. And so there's been an incremental application of that data over time, with or without AI, right? Or at least in terms of just understanding, tracking, surveilling, the population. But it has been used to some degree for public benefit as well. There's predictive analytics that's being used in healthcare and even in the legal domain. So there's political efficiencies, administrative efficiencies, functional efficiencies that have been achieved there. And now in terms of the, AGI versus this hyper-practical focus, it's clearly the latter where China has put its emphasis. And again, that also builds trust, right? Because the Chinese public is not seeing that, whereas in the West, huge amounts of venture capital are being expended, data centers are being deployed everywhere, energy is being hoarded to train AGI that may or may not be beneficial to their societies that are struggling with far more mundane, prosaic concerns right now. Whereas in China, AI is being deployed for public benefit and it is being socialized and democratized. So again, I don't see, though, this being a linear phenomenon, right? It's not that China will only think and act one way and Western countries only think and act another. But we in Western societies do absolutely face this gap between innovation, where we're radically high performing at the inventiveness phase and the kind of commercialization phase, and yet really weak in deployment in terms of spreading those benefits. And we see this with biomedical technologies, we see this with financial technologies, and in even energy technologies, where there's been a tremendous amount of invention in the West and not enough democratized deployment. And again, that's going to has cost us tremendously in terms of trust.
So just picking up on that point on the AI and global trust as relates to AI. And I was at a talk a little while ago hosted by NATO, talking about the challenges around COVID and how actually there were a need for some global domains around how countries manage the impact of it. And it got me thinking about AI and the need for more global domains for these conversations, given that the large language models, the information that feeds them, the way in which AI is developing is certainly global, if not being delivered at scale, perhaps in countries like China versus others. But more broadly, what is your view on the impact this has on trust globally?
I don't think that, there is not only the gap between the innovation and the deployment for public benefit within Western societies versus, let's say, China, but then at a global level, to the extent that AI models, whether it's training, inference, and so forth, the pace at which those are being deployed across industries and countries varies quite a bit. So we're not really going to have a uniform linear picture of trust increasing across the world in a harmonized fashion, because we have very, very divergent, bumpy regulation around this. And it's also changing all the time. It's changed across U.S. administrations now in just the last 1 year. Europe is, paring back a little bit on some of its stronger regulations in order to encourage innovation. And we have diffusion of technology, of course, as well. So I don't think that we're going to see one answer in this regard. It's definitely going to be a very, very diverse landscape when it comes to how AI is deployed, what industries it's deployed in, whether it genuinely does benefit certain members of the public, whether educational systems are transformed to genuinely make AI a kind of co-pilot, and support function for professionals versus simply, wiping out people's jobs, with not providing them any recourse. So, again, like migration, for example, or climate adaptation, this is one of those areas where, as much as we think of this as a set of technologies where actually some very powerful models are available off the shelf, there's still a real bumpiness to reality on the ground within and across the borders of nations.
Yeah. Anecdotally, I remember one of the trust studies released a few years ago where we were looking at that question of trust in technology. And in the emerging countries, emerging markets, let's say, the high levels of trust in technology compared to the established economies, let's say. What was interesting was them asked about the jobs, fear of job loss and the likes. And actually, even in those emerging economies where there's high trust in technology, fear of job loss was high. However, in the countries where perhaps technology was more mature to a certain degree, but more established Western economies, there was no fear of job loss, which made me laugh. How is it that someone who has very little trust in technology also fears very little about what technology is going to do? I don't know what it says about the way we're going to talk about technology, but I found that quite fascinating. Parag, final question from me, and just a personal and professional one. Do you trust the future, both as an analyst and as a person?
I think that there's a growing recognition that we simply cannot allow business as usual to continue to unfold. The world is really a complex adaptive system, and therefore no one person can fully grasp, fully steer the way in which global evolution is kind of unfolding. So individual agents, individual citizens are recognizing that. And therefore, I hope there will emerge, or there are authorities that one can put their trust in, that they can steer at hopefully a broader level rather than only a national level, either critical technologies or interventions for global public benefit. It's that tension between the potential for global action, if trust were available and present, to solve global problems. That's the biggest gap that I feel needs to be solved right now. And I don't think that we can generalize and say that the people of the world have all lost trust and would never return to a multilateral approach, to global solutions, versus the reality that as threats, again, particularly climate change and others, advance and evolve so rapidly, that we know that we can't really tackle these things alone. So I do trust that the pendulum is going to swing back relatively soon, if not rapidly, towards needing to trust in coordination for global problem solving.
It's a perfect way to end it. Thank you. That is all the time we have. Thank you, Parag, for your insights and expertise. And to our listeners, thank you for listening to The Trust Makers.
Thank you for tuning into The Trust Makers, an Edelman podcast in partnership with Advertising Week, where we speak with leaders and other trust builders across institutions. See you next time.